Did you know that historically in the last 10 years or so, one of the safest bets in college football is for Penn State to win 10 or more regular season games? It happens almost every time. I'm going to tell you why it'll happen again. That's Zach Seyko, Locked on Penn State, joining me here on the show. Their win total on FanDuel, Zach, is 9.5. And I think the reason it's not 10.5, maybe optically, is that that's a number reserved for a Georgia, a Texas, an Oregon, a Notre Dame. But I look at this Penn State schedule, and I think their entire season is going to be defined in a brutally tough 3-week stretch in the new look Big Ten that features a game at USC, at Wisconsin, and then hosting Ohio State. But if you win one of those games, I don't see a loss anywhere else.
I mean, I'd even add in Washington. That 4-week stretch, because you're going through a gauntlet. It's the fact that Washington's at the tail end of a road trip to Southern California. You got a bye week wedged in there, fine. But then you go to Camp Randall. Then you play possibly the potential. I don't think Georgia loses at that point. So a number 2 Ohio State Buckeyes team, and then the week after that, it's Washington. So that 4-week stretch it's going to define Penn State's season. An undisciplined team drops 2-3 out of those games, out of those 4 games. But Penn State has a veteran quarterback, 2 veteran running backs, a really experienced offensive and defensive coordinator. I know everybody has differing opinions about James Franklin. I mean, this is a tough schedule, Spencer. If you look at Pro Football Focus, they have one of the top 10 toughest schedules. I don't like when people say, "Oh, Penn State got lucky. They got a favorable break." No, this is a very tough schedule, starting with West Virginia and then going through that 3-week stretch. I'd argue it's a 4-week tough stretch of gauntlet type games.
Well, we disagree there. I don't think Washington in the state of Pennsylvania is going to pose a major challenge to Penn State. I think the Nittany Lions are a much more ready to compete team and program than Washington is this year. I mean, Jed Fish said at Big Ten Media Days in Indianapolis about a month ago at this point, or whenever it was, all the time is blending together, that this is a total rebuild. Because it is. You're replacing 21 starters from the team that went to the national championship. I expect Washington to be.
Your point.
I expect Washington to be a bowl team, but at home, coming off of what'll probably be a loss to Ohio State, because until I'm given compelling evidence otherwise, I struggle picking Penn State against the big boys in the Big Ten, because that's what the record has been. But they've dominated everybody else, and even against Ohio State and Michigan last year, it was a couple of single-digit losses. It's not like they were uncompetitive, that they got run off the field. It wasn't like Iowa in the Big Ten championship game against Michigan, losing 27-0 or whatever the score was. It was a competitive game, and I expect Penn State, though they did not have their best performance in the New Year's Six game against Ole Miss, I expect this to be a 10-plus win program. I think the schedule lines up for that very well.
And I don't want people to get the impression that I'm trying to signal that Washington is going to upset Penn State in the whiteout game in November, right? This is the middle of November, Pennsylvania. I know it rains in the state of Washington, but it's a different kind of cold in Pennsylvania.
Well, and it's a long trip.
It's a long trip, but that's my point, is that Penn State is going to USC, is going to Wisconsin, then playing the hypothetical number 2 Buckeyes, and then they host a competent Washington team. That's my point. That's just a tough 4-week stretch. Okay. If we look at, but your question, your debate about 9.5 wins, I think this is a 10-2 Penn State team. And 10-2 gets you potentially a home playoff game, get you into the playoffs, and get you a home playoff game. 9.5 is that's a really tight line if we're talking about this from the betting gambling angle, because if I predict 10-2, well, there's 0.5 wins for a margin of error here. But when you look at what Vegas already has projected for Penn State, they're favorited, or at least they're going to be favorited, in 11 out of the 12 games, except Ohio State. And Spencer, here's the key part of this. It's not like they're 2 touchdown underdogs to the Buckeyes. They're 3.5-point underdogs. I know it's a home game. I know it's at Beaver Stadium, but that's what Vegas thinks of these 2 teams on paper right now, matched up before the season starts, that the Buckeyes are only, give or take, 3 or 4 points better than the Nittany Lions in Beaver Stadium.
That gives me more confidence in Penn State being a 10-11 win team. And look, I think if they go into Morgantown and do what you and I have talked about, previously on this show, they should do, which is beat West Virginia, who
Yes.
could be a decent team in the Big 12, but Penn State is considerably better. And West Virginia, like Penn State, brings back a lot of their team from last year. I don't think home field advantage is going to be worth, 20 points or so, or whatever the margin was in last year's game. It was a solid Penn State win. I expect that to be the case again. You win that game, and then it's Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, UCLA, 4 straight games at home against programs that just are not going to be even close to Penn State. I think the Nittany Lions will roll in all 4. Then you go at USC. You got to watch out for that game.
Yes.
No doubt about it. You got to watch out for that game. At Wisconsin, I think that's a win. Ohio State I have as a loss. And then I think they end with 4 straight wins against Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland. So I'm going on the record here and saying James Franklin ups the ante of what he's done the last couple of years. I think the narrative around Penn State is, well, they're just a 10-2 team every year. Yeah. But they don't have Oregon. They have Washington instead, and they get them at home. They do have to play both of the LA schools, and going at USC is definitely a tougher break than going to UCLA because USC is a much, much better team than UCLA this year. I could see a Wisconsin or a USC trip up, but I can't see that week 1 in Morgantown. I can see a loss to Ohio State, but I could see an upset there, and that's why I land on 11-1.
And the reason I land on 10-2 is just because you just have to account for the margin of error. Penn State is in a position where they could actually go 12-0. If they get some lucky breaks and they catch some teams like an Ohio State that's better than them in a spot where they just, hey, they have more players available because of injury or whatever else, right? You can't predict these things. But on paper, preseason, all things are equal to start. Penn State's an 11-1 team. If you get some, again, if you catch some teams in some bad spots, and the same thing goes for Penn State, but you hope that they don't get into those bad spots. I just think with a trip to Southern California and then a trip back to Camp Randall, that's where if you're going to lose any of, like if that's where you're going to have your, I guess, mulligan, if you will, that's the spot to have it. If you and I agree, we agree that there's a loss to Ohio State in there, that your mulligan can only come against either of USC or Wisconsin, nowhere else. It can't be West Virginia. It can't be Washington. It's got to be one of those 2 games if you want them to cover this win total.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And normally on this show, Zach, my rule is I tend to like a team that has a returning trio of head coach, offensive coordinator, and quarterback. Now, Penn State has 2 of the 3, but in this instance, I actually like that there's a change at offensive coordinator. And I think Andy Kozelnicki can bring something to the table. Drew Allar with another year of experience. I was listening to an NFL podcast the other day from a former scout who said that NFL scouts have not sold their stock on Drew Allar and that there is another gear to his game. If you see him elevate even further beyond, it's not like he's been a bad quarterback. He's just had bad games in the last couple or last season. If he elevates himself this year, look, everything has to break right for anybody, even Georgia, to go 12-0. But
fair
11-12 wins feels like more of a realistic expectation if you unlock that next gear of Drew Allar. Because if you have another level of his play, if you get him to that next level, I could see him outplaying Will Howard, and then you're playing a team that has a better roster, but you have a better quarterback and you're at home, and that's a coin flip.
Well, I would take Drew Allar over Will Howard. That's an easy choice for me on any given day. Drew Allar has the NFL talent. Okay, he has the arm strength, he has the accuracy, he has the decision making. The question mark that people have about Drew is his mental tenacity. And it seems like he's worked on that. Is he, a guy that's going to run through a brick wall, kind of like a Trace McSorley or a Sean Clifford, right? A rally the troops kind of guy. That's just not who he is. And he's even accepted that. He's admitted like, hey, I'm just not the most vocal guy. But what you can't do, what you absolutely cannot do is act the way of what happened against Ohio State and Michigan, where it was like this solemn, gruesome, there were some tears, just after a loss. And I get it. Emotions understandable in any sport, but we have to not that kind of emotion. And that was addressed. That was an elephant in the room that was immediately addressed. And I think there's going to be a different version of Drew Allar. You're going to get a more complete version, not just a quarterback that, he has the arm talent. You're going to see somebody that's more of a dual threat. He's going to run the football more. I think those skeletons are behind him. I think he is going to be a little more mentally tough. Again, is he going to be a Trace McSorley energy type of guy? No, but just somebody that's not going to fall apart the second something goes wrong. I think that in itself is a major step forward for this Penn State team. And and again, he's in his third year, right? He's 19 years old a season ago. He was 19. He hasn't been playing quarterback, honestly, for that long. He started playing quarterback about 4 or 5 years ago. A lot of these college players have been playing the position itself for 9, 10 years, going back to Pee Wee.
No Oregon, no Iowa, no Michigan. Not necessarily in that order. I've seen worse schedules. That's why I see 10-plus wins for Penn State here once again. Zach Seyko, Locked On Nittany Lions. Zach, appreciate it as always.
Anytime, Spencer.